Hi there, this is Ben with Benediction Works. We are here today to make something called a strop, a sharpening strop, something that is used for sharpening woodworking tools. That's what I use them for principally, or shaving razors. I don't shave that much, so you'll have to take other shaving razor sharpeners' words for it. But also used for sharpening kitchen knives. Basically, the easiest and fastest way to get a razor sharp edge is a strop. You do your basic sharpening, you finish on a strop for 99% of purposes or more. That is all you need to create what is called a very micro convexity on the edge while polishing the edge, which gives you enough of an edge to shave with almost any tool. You can see on my left arm here, I've got what's called woodworker pattern baldness. This is the arm that I use to test whether or not I can get my basic tools like this shaving sharp. This is just a chisel, not particularly made for shaving, but shaving is a good way of testing to see if your stuff is basically sharp. There's a few ways to see if stuff is certain levels of sharpness. There's a few shortcuts to discern that. So but the strop is the best way or easiest way to finish something for incredibly functional sharpness. So we're going to show you how to do that. I do sell them on my Etsy store for inexpensive. You're going to see how much time it takes to make one of those. I'm providing them sort of as a service for people who want to get into woodworking. Well, also I'll say you can make them yourself if you can get your hands on the basic materials that are required. So what we start with is, this is a block of shelving, particle board shelving that's melamine coated. The melamine coating is nice and water resistant. And the particle board, which is all around the edges now, especially now that the shelving has been cut out. Particle board is very dimensionally stable. Any sort of wood product will respond to humidity by shrinking, growing. The thing about particle board is that it will remain flat because it will expand and contract very evenly versus a piece of wood where, somewhat depending on the grain and the wood itself, the species will expand and contract sort of unpredictably, not entirely unpredictably, but you probably don't want to bother putting too much thought in it when there are products like particle board or medium density fiber boards. Another common MDF is another common material for woodworking, any sort of block that you need that's going to stay sharp. So we have our piece of particle board. I've actually sealed the edges with a waterproof glue, which does not completely prevent moisture intrusion that will cause any sort of warping, but it will prevent incidental water contact from damaging the strop in any way. It is made out of leather. You don't want to get it wet regardless. So I did get glue. You can see this is the surface that we're going to adhere the strop to. So it's a little bit ugly just based on what tools I used to cut it. I used my sort of coarse tooth circular saw blades. The other side's a lot prettier, as you can see. So we're going to take the bad side, and I've made Sharpie marks all over it. And this is sort of over the top. You don't really need to do this step necessarily, especially if you didn't get glue on the surface. But what we're going to do is, I have a flat surface, a very flat surface by granite, so-called machinist surface plate, which is used for measuring things. Actually, that's the least most iconic used by woodworkers very frequently, though, for when they need a flat surface. But there's all sorts of flat surfaces that you can find. So we've just abraded the surface until there's still some Sharpie marks remaining, but they have scratches through them. So we're going to call that flat enough. We've done what's called lapping. We've taken a shape, in this case it's perfectly flat shape, and we have abraded something on our shape in order to get the same shape, which is flat. Usually when people are talking about lapping, they're talking about getting something flat. So that's not necessarily the case as far as I'm aware. There's that. So what we are going to do, we have our flat block right now. and everything's sealed with wood glue. We're going to take a piece of leather, and this is a piece of leather that is about a millimeter or so. I have some digital calipers that we can use to measure this. Not perfectly because it's compressible, but let's see what we got here. About almost more than a millimeter, 1.37 millimeters. That's good enough for what one of the functions of the strop that you want is you want it to be somewhat compressible, because that allows for the micro convexity that will polish the extreme end of the edge. The extreme edge. Got some sawdust on there, but that's okay. I have a vacuum. Strong vacuum. So basically what we're going to do is we are creating one of these. This is a piece of leather, double-sided taped to a piece of wood. There's many ways that you could adhere the leather to this piece of wood product, not really wood, as you'd normally, what wood normally implies, just plain wood. But wood product, this particle board shelving. And this is double-sided taped and screwed on. Now in a pinch, if I weren't selling these, if I were just making one of these and handing it off to a friend or relative, I might just double-side tape the piece on, and I can actually show you my first strop is just a spare piece of leather, fairly thick, and I would just hold this while I did my stropping, which was this is bigger than a credit card somewhat, but not spectacularly so. But this worked fine. What you want is a piece of leather that you can push the tool into, drag the tool over with. The green stuff is an abrasive compound which assists in the sharpening process. It's not inherently required for stropping per se. Stropping, one of the functions is that stropping can break off the sort of sheet metal foil edge that forms on the end of whatever you are sharpening. For me, most common a chisel or a woodworking plane blade. So what we're going to start with is actually drilling into the board with our first two holes that will determine where everything else goes, basically. So what you want is to take, got this oversized piece of leather that we're going to cut down in place when everything is done. You want it to be able to fold over all the edges like that. So you can see it folds over the sides there. And that's mainly going to be to give screws a place to hold onto the leather so that the leather can't really peel away from the double-sided tape. So we're going to start right here, I think. And that will be good enough, more than good enough. So I've got a center punch, which is not strictly necessary. And here's my screws, by the way, just my little beer can full of screws. It's my temporary non-magnetic screw catcher. So I've got a center punch right here. And if you're just making one of these at home for yourself, then you can sort of go however you want in terms of situating the screws. You don't want to go too close to the edge because that will that's where the particle board is weakest. It would be different if you were putting it into the sides of solid wood. Although the edges of wood products are always weak, at least in some direction. So what we're going to do is put our first screw in here, and I've got my combination square set up so that it's about 15 millimeters from the edge, a little bit more because the center punch has its own thickness. We're going to do that, punch that in. going to use a power drill. This is just a basic screwdriver with a basic drill bit. If you're planning on making stuff, basic screwdriver and drill bit is a good idea. Okay, looks good. Okay, so now the magic here in terms of, well, one more aspect of overkill is that I've drilled a pilot hole that accepts a screw, and it's a fairly tight pilot hole. So what I am doing is I am taking a screw. This is going to be difficult to see. I'll have to provide a separate picture, but I have taken a screw. You can probably see that something is up there that I have turned into a thread forming tap. A tap is similar to a screw, but it's made for cutting threads. And that is going to give us optimal bite. That is going to work wonderfully for, typically in wood products, you drill a pilot hole if you want something to have maximum bite. Even softwoods, where the screw will just drive in. If you drill a pilot hole, that will allow the threads to form most evenly for fastening and refastening. Pilot holes are always a good idea if you want to refasten the screw and have maximum holding power. So we're gonna finish tapping that, and we're good there. And then we're going to just hold this in place with this screw, regular screw, final screw. And these are actually sheet metal screws. These are sheet metal screws from Harbor Freight. Sheet metal screws are pretty inexpensive. They're fine as basic woodworking screws. They don't have really big threads that are made for biting into wood, which can be a good thing for screwing into particle board, even though things are reinforced with this strong glue here. Too much bite creates more bite of the screw, can create more stress on the wood. The bigger threads can create more stress. So that's good for fastening power if the wood or wood product can take it. There's all sorts of details to threads. There's a site called boltscience.com, which has all sorts of neat stuff that you can learn about that. But you can see I'm driving the screws in with hand. You could do it with a that powered screwdriver, but this gives a sort of tactile feel as to whether or not things are going to strip or if things are going in properly. If something's going in crooked, you can correct that more easily. So I do everything by hand. What we're going to do is we're going to stretch this a little bit. Just a little bit, stretching it taut. Now the leather is somewhat elastic, but we just want to take up any slack. That's what we did right there. Pulled on it, yanked on it, and then center punched it. So we've got our tapping screw, our thread forming screw right here. Just gonna plug that in. And once we've done this and fastened our initial, we've gotten our initial positioning and bolting down of the leather, that creates the magic of the strops, the conforming but strong leather that won't be damaged, as opposed to like a piece of foam or something. That would get damaged pretty easily, get cut pretty easily. Leather is pretty strong. It's not trivial to cut leather. It's not like paper, it's not like foam. Leather is an interesting material. Thick skin. Some people will talk about stropping on the backs of their hands. And different leathers or skins have different stropping properties, potentially. And what we also have here, I have some washers, which will help to prevent the fastening of the head onto the strop from twisting the leather around. Washers are good at that. The head will rotate on the washer rather than rotating on the leather while the washer sort of bites into the leather. And by the way, we are doing the strop with the smooth side as the side that we're adhering. We're going to end up with the fuzzy side as our working side, the side that we're actually using to finishing sharpening things. So the details to that are more than I want to go into here. There are all sorts of details to strops and stropping. I'm going to say, as I'm marketing it currently, this is a brutally effective strop. If you have no particular known needs, how would you really know what you need unless you've already experimented with a strop? Then this is going to be the starting place to get your woodworking tools shaving sharp enough that you can pare end grain for dovetail boxes, that sort of thing. So fuzzy side as the working side, as a sharpening side, those are common, is what I will say for now. The fuzziness grabs a little bit, retains abrasive compound a little bit more. Now you can go on several websites. I recommend the scienceofsharp.blogspot.com. I'll put it down below. That is an amazing website for someone who studies using electron microscope, one of the most demanding, surprisingly most demanding applications of blades and edges, which is shaving. Stropping is incredibly common in shaving. Think of the old barbers moving their blade along the edge. That's pretty iconic. So now we've got our bolts in there holding the leather down basically. Now we're going to begin applying the double-sided tape. Although before we do that, we should take just a little bit of sandpaper and rough up the leather. So when you sand something for better adhesion, you're both roughing things up and cleaning the surface a little bit. Because we have those bolts for overkill, we don't have to do it too much. There's some black dust coming off. There's some little striations that you probably can't see directly, but the light might hit it differently. So here we go. Double-sided tape is right here, of course. Need an assistant to yell at me that things are in such and such location. Grab some scissors. Okie dokie. So we're going to get a fairly clean edge there. It doesn't need to be perfect. And this is going to be invisible once it's all said and done. You could also clean the leather a little bit with some isopropyl alcohol. I just wiped it off with my hand. That'll be good enough. Now, if you wanted to do fuzzy side down, then something like contact cement would probably be called for. Yeah, it's a little bit messy, a little bit noxious. But there's all sorts of products specifically for working with leather and bonding it to different substrates. You could call this particle board, shelving block, a substrate, I believe. The straight that's below, whatever that means. Okie dokie. That'll be pretty good. I want it just so that I'm not going to have to drill into the tape. We're going to clip the corners a little bit, and that's going to be a theme for our strop in terms of the corners being a part where this flat stuff that we're applying can sort of compete at the corners and render things not flat. So we want to get rid of those a little bit. Now, the double-sided tape is fairly squishy. It's got its own squishiness, and I've experimented with sandpaper on foam and stuff like that, and that actually creates something similar to a leather strop, although it's purely abrasive rather than some of the finer detail stuff that's going on with strops, leather strops. Again, you can look up some Sharpen nerds and you'll learn all sorts of stuff. Brent Beach is another good sharpening nerd. You learn all sorts of stuff from. He's got his own sort of a simple, just informational website. Now, whenever you run into sharpening gurus, you want to take it with a grain of salt, because you want to look at what they're doing besides just sharpening, because there's theoretical sharpening, and then there is work sharpening for work, for doing work. And for that, we are creating something similar to how Paul Sellers or even Matthias Wandel would sharpen, although Matthias Wandel resorts to even more unusual practices. You can look up his video, Hand Plane Blade Sharpening for Barbarians, which is sort of making fun of the sharpening nerd people in terms of theoretical sharpening versus practical sharpening. So that's why I like Science of Sharp blog, is because he is focused on shaving something very practical. So we are going to stay in frame. We are going to screw those screws back in. We're avoiding drooping the leather onto the double-sided tape right now, and we're gonna stretch the leather over the double-sided tape. And you want to be careful with this step somewhat. This is why I do it upside down. We want to go straight over while stretching it just a little bit, and it's not going to have immediate adhesion. So what you can do is use your palm. You could use a dowel or something like that as a rolling pin. There we go. I'm even going to loosen these screws and yank down on this side now. And this is going to create a nice flat strop for us. We've got that flat strop substrate. And now we're going to be adding screws pretty much just to prevent these screws from being able to yank onto the double-sided tape that's keeping everything flat. Hand's getting hot, so that heat might be getting into the double-sided tape and helping, but mostly just pressure. Okay, so now I'm going to stretch things taut. Stretching it taut. Now we're going to add the second set of screws, clamping it very lightly in the vise. Okay, this is the same thing as last time. We've got our double-sided tape holding things together. I'm gonna peel it back, knock off some of that dust. Probably not important in actuality. There's some overkill things happening. Probably some places where people don't think I'm doing enough, not enough overkill, but it's all subjective. I'm just trying to provide a product. I'm going through the leather now, tapping through the leather, which doesn't really matter. Will create a little bit more resistance unnecessarily, but I've got to back the tap out anyways. Okie dokie. Creating threads, you want to go in and out, in and out. That's another thing that using just a manual driver helps with. You have to flick a switch for every quarter turn. Reverse the screwdriver. And honestly, you could just eyeball these screw holes. You just want to make sure that screws are not going to run into each other and you're not that close to the edge. You might have to experiment on a scrap piece or something in terms of what might break whatever you are working on. Plywood can be nice and flat. I wouldn't rely on screws holding into the ends. Well, particle board's not great holding screws in the ends either, but I've had great success with these screws, with pre-tapping them. So this is the, I don't know, 7th strop I've made, including prototypes of this general style. Start to give them a little yank. Dun, 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 dun. How you doing? That's good. That's good. This is our last of the screws on the ends. I think I mentioned we are going to prove that this strop works. We're going to get it to that shaving sharpness, and I'm going to show you how little of pre-strop sharpening is required. So this is where we've got to cut the leather. I mentioned the corners creating a cramming together for real estate. So what I'm going to do is, let's get this a little bit more in frame. What I'm going to do is pull on both of the sides. We've got pulling on one side here, pulling on this side here, and we are going to take, I have a sharp pair of scissors this is a cheap pair of scissors that I've specifically sharpened for cutting leather. We are going to, I just cut down there and give it a little snip, and that will prevent any sort of that competition folding around the edges there, and that'll keep the strop nice and flat. It's probably overkill. I mean, how often do you go to the very edge of a strop? You probably don't even have any abrasive compound there if you're using abrasive compound, but makes me feel better. And there's a million ways to make strops. This is just based on what I have. I call this a Lazarus tool because it's made from recycled materials. It's made from old upholstery leather, which is, like I said, about, well, we measured at 1.37 millimeters. So I'm going to stretch it taut and cut. You just basically don't want too much hanging around the edges in case it does touch a wet counter or something like that. So I'm not too worried about the cosmetics of this product. It is a Lazarus product. There's beautiful things made out of recycled materials, but I find something's beauty to be 100% in the garage, in my workspace. I find it to be based 100% off of its usefulness. Anything that leaves the garage needs to be pretty, unless it's going to someone else's workshop, like this tool. It is a tool. So here we go with this one, this side. Give just a little snip up the corner. We got this side. And a little snip up the corner. Yeah, my tools are not looking for pure function. The idea of make something as functional as possible and then make it pretty is, the more time you spend on something, or I should say the less time you can spend on something, that's a certain type of function. And these will last for quite a long time if they're not treated like garbage, which is something that you can do with them. They're from recycled materials in the first place, but no reason to, no need to. The less you pay for something, the poorer you treat it. It's a common psychological phenomenon. It's one reason why people take better care of their own stuff in the first place. I'm sure everyone's familiar with that. Some aspect. I started realizing that about video games when I was buying my own video games when I was like 19 or 20. I got good at piracy. I think that's outside the statute of limitations. And, if I bought something, there was some sort of scarcity involved in it, I would bother to play it. Otherwise, if it wasn't terribly impressive as a game, I would not care about it a super duper amount. So we've stretched it. I've got it clamped in my vise. Pulled it taut just a little bit. So on the edges here, we're going to do the same thing. We're on drill bit though. We want a smaller drill bit. And then we're dealing with screws that are shorter. So again, a reason that we're not going to the very corners. It's a lot of reasons. But one being so that we have screws not hitting other screws. These are all about 5/8 of an inch. So here we go. That. So I do have a little cap screw here. This sheet metal screw. but it's not as ornate as the larger one. Generally, the smaller the screw that you're putting into a wood or a wood product, the less important it is to even drill a proper pilot hole or tap or whatever. The less sensitive the wood will be in general. And we're going to actually use 3 screws in here total, but we're going to start with these 2 on this side. Yeah, bigger the pilot hole relative to the screw, less pre-tapping or careful screw insertion is required. And the smaller the screw, also, just in general, the less pre-tapping is required. Now, this sheet metal screw pack is a variety pack, so I'm actually using not pan head screws, but the oval head screws. So just to make those bite a little bit better, I'm actually using countersink. So you could just use more pan head screws, which have a flat, they're flat under the head. These are actually angled under the head. So we're going to add just a tiny bit of a reasonable angle. It's actually going to go mostly just into the leather. Probably not even really necessary, but will prevent cracking as we get that bite as the head goes. Hits the leather and the wood. So again, you can just use pan head screws. If I didn't buy a variety pack that's an astoundingly good deal from Harbor Freight, I would just use the pan head screws all around. But these oval head screws have their own particular aesthetic. Just use regular countersunk screws, which have a flat surface within the angled neck. So many paths to victory here. Probably use nails. Many paths to victory. Many paths to victory. So we're going to leave the excess there just that we can yank on it for the last middle screw, but I don't want to adjust my combination square yet. So one of the nice things about working with excess is that you have bits that you can grab. No problem. Grab and stretch a little bit. So get our drill bit back in there. And I burped. That's a reminder to another fun drinking thing in my video here. I'm sure that looks wonderful. This is my first video, so I'm not too worried about it. I'll probably make another strop video at some point. So there's looking good. This way. You probably insert the screws one by one. The drill bit's actually hitting the other screw there. So this flag, put little masking tape flags in the drill bit. Those are, I can move that masking tape flag down a little bit. Perhaps it creeped up. But the screws and the combination square are set properly so that just barely nothing's running into each other. The first one of these I made, I definitely cracked the particle board. Then I glued it back together. This is my personal one. You can see it's got a little wing back there, which was a experiment for various reasons. I sold my first 2 ones on Etsy like that. Well, I haven't gotten a complaint. I haven't gotten a review yet. But easy enough to clip off, I suppose. But that was a way of getting sort of another place to clamp it besides directly on the face of the strop, and to provide a surface that has no abrasive compound on it. It can be flipped over to provide it's a smooth leather surface, but I finally decided that at this price, it's better. A convertible $10 strop doesn't make sense. It's better just to get another strop. It's $10 shipped, by the way. So take a look at the video to see how long one of these takes me. I mainly make these when my brain is sort of petering out. I'm like, okay, I just need to do something to put on Etsy. Don't want to think about what spoon design I'm doing or anything like that. There we go. It's just something autopilot at this point after the first few prototypes. Just to go, okay, I'm making a strap, making something useful and tangible. Useful and tangible for someone. And then I'll worry about the big earners when I need to think about them. Okay, so now that we've got everything with the combination square set, the combination square is set to, I use a metric one, set to just over 15 millimeters. Now we can take that out, the ruler out. Now we're going to look to see center, screw to screw, 14. So that's, we want to go to 7 millimeters, 14 millimeters divided by 2 is 7. Got our combination square. There, 7, 7, 7. Taut just a little bit. Going in that second time can just help to clear sawdust. You know, wood is kind of smushy, so it can accept a drill bit while clogged and cause a mess. And certainly clog the flutes as a drill bit. That's very common. Besides starting a drill, drilling wood can be more annoying than other materials. One more screw, and we got some more cutting, and we are all good. Feels nice and that slight squishiness. Feeling good. We're just going to pull this around and rely on the vise for holding our holding pot. Don't want to or need to clamp it too tight. Should be at 7. Yep, there we go. Okay, we're almost done with the basic strop making. I want to stress that there's a million ways to make a strop, and you saw my neophyte strop earlier, just a credit card sized piece of leather. I would just hold that, got the job done for basic sharpening to incredibly sharp. Okay, there's that. So now we're ready to cut. I've got my sharp scissors. You can use a pair of like aviation snips for cutting sheet metal also. I got those. Makes you feel like I'm on a cooking show. You can use a pair of these also. My Sharpie scissors just sort of glide through the through everything. So we've got our excess right here. This can be the easy side. Plenty of excess. There we go. If you pull too hard, it'll create a wave, which I've done. Still going to sell those. Doesn't affect the functionality. And all the screws there prevent any tugging on the double-sided tape. So everything will remain adhered and flat. It's nice if you can do everything in one glide. That keeps everything, keeps the cut smooth. That turned out pretty well, even though I had to interrupt it. Okay, so there is our strop. Ain't nothing wrong with that. Celebratory sip. Drinking game. Take a drink every time that you finish a strop. So, done with our screwdriver. Done with our scissors. Got a spare screw in there. So now we are going to apply abrasive compound. Now, as far as, so the abrasive compound is super fine. It sort of takes the place of finishing with like a 10,000 grit, 20,000 grit water stone or ceramic stone or whatever, while allowing the leather to do its work, creating that micro convexity. And indeed, I have experimented with just putting the abrasive compound, superfine abrasive compound, onto a flat surface, and that actually works great. I have a hard time believing that any normal woodworker, 99.9, maybe if you're a luthier or something, then you might need more. But that worked great. So the point being, most chromium oxide sticks that you buy, especially if they're marketed as for final sharpening, around 1 micron particles. They work great. Green is good. Until you know that you need something more than shaving sharp, there's many products that you can buy. This is something that I bought off Amazon, extra fine sharpening abrasive compound. It's waxy. It's like a big crayon. And indeed, chromium oxide being green, you can think of paints. Like paints often have white titanium oxide or dioxide, and that's what gives it the white color. Chromium oxide is often used for green, or at least a certain kind of green. Because I'm selling these to customers, I really go for it. You don't normally need that much of the stropping compound. In fact, there's probably a call against that, but it's got its own waxiness, its own kind of elasticity, liability to conform. You'll see what I do is I will actually take a little brass brush and I will sort of condition it back and forth, just driving the chromium oxide in deeper and pulling some of the chromium oxide that sort of created a solid layer on the surface. Pulls that out. So again, I've experimented with solid chromium oxide abrasive crayon on just a block, and that works great. Seems to have even a wild stropping effect. But this really, I can say that I'm giving my customers their money's worth with a fully impregnated strop. Otherwise, you don't need to worry about it too much. You don't need to be neurotic about it, getting all the compound on there. There's diamond compounds, those are relatively cheap now. This whole brick was 13 bucks. I'm looking at, there's even cheaper chromium oxide compounds from industrial suppliers, a big 3-pound bar for 13 bucks. Again, whatever. You need to experiment with those, but chromium oxide is always fine. It's some measure of fine as far as I can tell. It's an abrasive compound like aluminum oxide, silicon carbide. It does minor cutting. There's abrasive compounds, so-called abrasive compounds, that don't cut. This buffing terminology. It's interesting, but point being, you can rely on the green stuff. Typically, that's the most common. You can see I've been experimenting with the blue stuff. It's hard to tell that it's blue. It's my webcam. But that's been fine also. Again, a lot of the magic is, the whole point of this is that the leather's doing the magic. But what we're going to do to test this is we're going to take a sharpening stone from the Dollar Tree. We're going to dull this chisel, and we're going to sharpen it, and then we are going to finish sharpening it on the strop and prove that this simple strop, which is about $10 off of my Benediction Works Etsy store, we're going to prove the efficacy of everything. Okay, so let's re-sharpie this chisel. So I'm not necessarily going to sharpen the whole bevel. What I'm going to focus on is at least sharpening the tip. First, we're going to dull it. Which, how can we dull it? Here's a piece of stainless steel nut. So the way to tell if something's basically sharp is, will it snag on your fingernail? And the answer is no, not really. You could dull it even a little bit more. Now also, Sharpie is the way, that's the best way to sharpen it. And it certainly will not do any shaving. There's no hair coming off. We're going to adjust the exposure here a little bit. There we go. Whoops, should have done that from the beginning. First video. So definitely no hair coming off. So let's do the sharpening. This is an oil stone, so I've got some oil there on the coarse side. Oh, it's a little bit much. Don't want that to get to my device necessarily. It would be the end of the world. Okay, so a thirsty oil stone absorbing a lot of oil. So we're gonna get the red off of at least the tip of this chisel. We're gonna work up a burr on the backside. Looks like we're there already. Yeah, we're there. So we've got scratch pattern and no more red on the tip. You can see there's red elsewhere. Then we also have a burr catching my fingernail on the back side. So now we'll flip the sharpening stone over to the finer side. I'm just using masking tape to protect my vise from, well, any embedded sharpening stone particles, first of all, but also the oil. So there's some oil. Sharpening there. What we could do is take some, we're going to re-sharpie it. Put that Sharpie back on there, just to make sure we hit everything on the finer side. This is sort of a medium coarse, medium fine sharpening stone. Yeah, looking good. And with most sharpening stones, when you're just worrying about raising the burr, you can go forward and back, forward and back, forward and back. So now we've got a nice burr raised. We're going to go just back now, and that's going to create more of a wire edge. It's going to create a floppier, thinner edge. We're going to use the sharpening stone and the strop to deburr. So now is where the strop works its magic. So we're going to just use it like the sharpening stone, only backwards, only backwards. We're going to do the bevel side, and we're going to do the back side. What we're going to do, so we started on the bevel side, polish everything, that wire burr a little bit thinner. So now we're at the point where, yeah, the wire burr has started to fall off. So now it's definitely catching the fingernail. It's definitely catching the edge of the pen. So we should be able to just finish right here. And often, so Paul Sellers I think says 50 strokes. And it can help actually to swap between sides, because that wire burr, despite the abrasive, that wire edge being bent back and forth is what will cause it to fall off on a really microscopic level. There's always more micro, up to like at least the micron level. So after a while, you can't really feel the burr. We're gonna go, I don't know, 20 more strokes. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1. 1. So now we've got a very nice feeling edge. If you're feeling very confident, you can actually peel your thumbnail, your thumb away from your thumbnail, and run your thumbnail across the edge. It's feeling very smooth, and this is all based off of stropping after using an inexpensive, medium fine, like 300 grit sharpening stone. But now let's see what it can do in terms of shaving. Let's lower the exposure even a little bit more. Just for this, just to make that hair pop out. Let's go here. So if that's not shaving sharp, I don't know what is. Didn't hurt, didn't pull out any extra skin flakes. Um, Now, one thing about getting a woodworking tool shaving sharp is depending on the tool and what you're using it for, it'll pretty much immediately become not shaving sharp, but still sharp enough to catch the pen or your fingernail. And that's what I would call working sharpness. And then you can occasionally strop it to, once you've been working it with it for a little bit, to get it even a little bit sharper for its working sharpness, and then eventually it'll dull. If you're pairing dovetails or something, your sharpening regimen might need to be even finer and more detailed. But if you're chopping mortises with a bench chisel or something like that, or a mortising chisel, this is the bench chisel that I was speaking of. This is an inexpensive chisel, 6-pack for $10, something like that. It's made out of chrome vanadium, which is harder to sharpen than high carbon, plain hard carbon steel, blah, blah, blah. As you saw, there's no problem to get it shaving sharp with one of these strops. So that's the profit right there, showing that you can get it shaving sharp. Again, not selling them for very much because they're made out of recycled materials, kind of against the spirit to, it's like pallet wood coffee tables sold for a lot. There might be something to that, but not for me. They're inexpensive enough. You can order these without compound or with grain compound. I'm going to sell extra decants, so to speak, of offcuts of big blocks of compound so that you don't need to buy a 20-year supply. So that's it. That's a strop. I don't know what else I can do to prove it to you besides getting a chisel shaving sharp. No trickery there. Yeah, works great. Will last for a long, long time, unless you treat it like crap because it was inexpensive. So cheers to that, Mr. New Strop. Have a great day, everyone. Contact me at benedictionworks@gmail.com if you need any help making something. Follow me on Twitter at benedictionworks with an X, or Instagram, benedictionworks spelled properly. Facebook, which is also benedictionworks. It's going to be posted all right here on the video. More frequent updates coming soon. I just wanted to show you this product. You can make one. You can buy it from me for less time and hassle than getting the parts yourself and doing everything yourself. Not that you couldn't do it yourself in a pinch, as you saw. Not the most complicated thing in the world to get what I would call something brutally effective. So thanks for watching. Have a great day. Contact me if you need my help for anything. Bye.